Hi there, I'm John Stewart, and welcome to Last Call for Tuesday, the 28th of April. Grant Walker will have Heads Up for you on Wednesday, the 29th, from 10 o'clock. In news from the courts, the company director at the centre of serious fraud office charges of bribery totalling more than $1 million says he's astounded by the allegations, which he calls offensive. On Tuesday, Stephen James Borlase, 50, Barry Kenneth James George, 68, and one other person who has name suppression appeared in the North Shore District Court to face charges of corruption and bribery of an official. No pleas were taken. The SFO alleges bribery of more than $1 million involving previous employees of Auckland Transport and Rodney District Council. It says Mr. George and an unnamed associate received undisclosed payments or gratuities from Progens Limited director Mr. Borlase, who supplied both Auckland Transport and Rodney District Council, while the pair were working in engineering and management roles. But Mr. Borlase has today hit back at the claims, which he strongly denies. The alleged gratuities include cash, travel, accommodation and entertainment given between 2005 and 2013. Mr. Borlase, however, says he's confident the success of his business is only due to hard work, professionalism, and because we are a good ethical corporate. He says he was astounded when the issues were first raised by the SFO, but has fully cooperated with its investigations. The SFO allegations say a culture was created in the Road Maintenance Division where the acceptance of gratuities was normal. Mr. Borlase says, "Not only do I deny the claims, I am completely confident that no inappropriate or unlawful payment has been made by my company. All the marketing budget for the company has been lawful, open and fully accounted for." Mr. Borlase says he considers it normal business practice for a company to foster good relationships through marketing, but this never included any express or implied insistence on any kickback or contract award. I find this suggestion offensive. Mr. Borlase is an engineer with 25 years' experience, with this being the first time his business has ever been questioned. He has stood down from Progens pending the result of the case and declined to apply for name suppression. He says, "I hope the business community takes a keen interest in this concerning case, as I consider my company's behaviour and business practices to be common and widespread and have long been accepted as normal and lawful. I consider that I have nothing to hide or to be ashamed of." The three defendants have been remanded on bail until May the 18th. And that story from Hamish McNichol. In business news, a select gathering of 15 leading Asian and 15 top Māori business leaders assembled on Friday night with the simple aim of doing business with people they had never met before. Organised by New Zealand Asian Leaders, or NZAL, and hosted by BNZ, the Taniwha Dragon Round Table comprised 30 hand-selected, invitation-only business leaders, whom NZAL says had the real business projects to progress in what resembled a business speed-dating crash course for high-achieving Asia-Pacific people. Following the direction of NZAL founder Mei Chen, participants were requested on 3 different occasions to cross the room and introduce themselves to a business person of different ethnicity and engage with him or her for a 10-minute period using 3 different Māori Asian business-driven questions. Minister for Māori Development and Associate Economic Development Minister Te Uroroa Flavel says the Māori economy has a conservative net worth of about $42 billion and that dialogue needed to be opened up between Māori and Asian people. He's expressed his admiration for the format of the evening and says he hopes it may develop in time to a one-day conference at which deals can be cut between Māori and Asians. According to Mei Chen, the invitation list was narrowed down to those NZAL believed had a serious intention of doing business together. Ms. Chen says, if you look at Asian cultures in general, just like Maori, the focus is very much on long-term relationships, not one-offs. It's about finding someone that you can be in a business partnership with long-term. And that story from Jamie Ball.
Wharf update. Stanley Bay resident Carol Banks has filed fresh judicial review court proceedings in the High Court at Auckland against Ports of Auckland's wharf extensions. Mrs. Banks, who's studying towards a BA in Ancient Greek, wants the court to order Ports of Auckland to stop work because the application for consents was never notified and the effect of extensions work will have on inner harbour beaches such as Stanley, Little Shoal and Sentinel Bays. After filing the proceedings at the end of last week, Carol Banks' solicitor daughter Ellie Banks has now started a fundraising web page to fund the fight. On her Give a Little page, Ellie Banks, who's on maternity leave from litigation lawyers McElroy's, says she's asking people to give $1,850 to cover the court filing fee and any order for security of costs. She says unnamed lawyers representing Mrs. Banks are undertaking the case free. Ellie Banks says her mother is not seeking to profit from the public outcry over the Bledisloe Wharf extensions. She just basically wants to ensure she's not exposed to costs for bringing a proceeding on behalf of Aucklanders. As soon as the target fundraising amount is raised, the page will be closed down. These proceedings come after Urban Auckland filed judicial review proceedings challenging the lawfulness of Auckland Council's resource consents for the wharf extensions. The court threw out Urban Auckland's interim application for a stop to POAL's extension work and agreed with the ports company view the case should proceed straight to a substantive hearing, as the arguments would be canvassed twice if the interim application went ahead. The case has been set down for the beginning of June.
NBR Radio with AUT. AUT Research, benefiting New Zealand. AUT.ac.nz/catalyst.
This is Sally Lindsay talking to Chris Hutching, Property Editor of NBR. Chris, the Earthquake Recovery Authority has now decided that it will start downsizing. What is happening there?
Well, it's still a little bit of a mystery, like everything at CERA, Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. Things are a little bit shrouded in mist, but it's become a department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, which is a weird new animal. I don't think there has been one before. I understand it is the first one. What it means, goodness knows. But anyway, there's a plan underway at the moment. A cunning plan is being devised to transfer its responsibilities to local government or other agencies. Now, the work, I think, of CERA will continue, but what will happen to all of its staff is a matter of conjecture, and I think there's roughly 300 to 400 people employed there. Some of them will obviously be looking around for other work, and others possibly might transfer over to the new agencies, whatever they are. It brings up the question of what CERA's achievements have been, and those that would champion CERA would say, well, it made sure that buildings were made safe, it oversaw the demolition of areas which might, for all we know, still have tons of rotten, half-demolished old buildings on them, but when it's come to the rebuild, it hasn't really worked, and exactly why. There are a myriad of reasons. We've talked about them before. So moving from CERA's transition to EQR, the Earthquake Commission, as readers may know or listeners may know, EQR, the Earthquake Commission, has a partnership with Fletcher's to repair homes where the damage is under $100,000. Now that is also coming to an end because I think the government just wants to see this thing wrapped up. There are several hundred people who are still in this awkward position where they have not come to an agreement with, it could be several thousand actually, judging by the number of people that turned up to a meeting the other week, who have not actually been satisfied. So just what's going to happen there, whether there's going to be some unhappiness because EQC wants to shovel money at them and say goodbye, had enough of you, been too long, or whether or not they will work out this long tail, I don't know. Now, there are something like 450 contractors involved with Fletcher EQR, as it's known. So those people also will probably be looking elsewhere for work, whether or not it means that their work is over is another matter, because if there are cash settlements, then these people still need their homes repaired. It's just that it'll be managed by the people themselves. So there are some big changes going on in Christchurch over the next few weeks and months. Now, turning our attention to Auckland, Sally, I want you to tell us the latest developments on the Ports of Auckland saga, where the ports want to develop the jetty, and there's been a lot of public disquiet and council disquiet about that. And during the course of what you tell us, could you also outline a little bit about the governance of this? Looking from the outside in, it seems very strange that we have a company that seems to be saying it's responsible to itself rather than its shareholders. And this is partly because of the governance arrangements on the boards of directors. You don't have councillors on this board like you do in many other cities around New Zealand. For example, Christchurch, there's always a councillor or two on the Littleton Port Company, so they tend to know what's going on, and you might say that the views of the shareholders are a bit more aligned. So how do you see things shaping up this week, Sally?
This morning, court proceedings are being filed by Stanley Bay woman Carol Banks, who lives in a $3 million house in that suburb. So she's taken similar action to Urban Auckland and filed a judicial review in the High Court asking that Ports of Auckland be ordered to stop work on the wharf extensions. We're at the end of Bledisloe Wharf. Whether she'll have any luck, who knows. I think the case will just be a call over this morning and probably be set down for a hearing at another time if the court decides to hear it, because I understand it would be pretty similar to Urban Auckland's case, which is set down for a hearing for 3 days at the beginning of June. And in the meantime, Auckland Council has called a special meeting this afternoon to discuss exactly what you were talking about, Chris, the governance of Ports of Auckland. Ports of Auckland is separate and is run by ACIL, which is a CCO under the Auckland Council. The Auckland Council decided to set it up like this because it didn't want to have any interference in the day-to-day running of the port. I know it's unusual and other councils have councillors on this, but this was decided right when the Super City was set up, and it's always been that way. And as a result of all the argy-bargy that's been going on over the past few weeks between the protesters and Ports of Auckland, both sides have taken legal opinions. Ports of Auckland have taken legal opinions on their responsibility and duties as directors and have been told firmly that their responsibilities and duties are to make sure the port company operates effectively and makes a profit. So this afternoon, the council is meeting with its governance body, lawyers and senior advisors to see what their next steps can be. One of the actions on the table is probably to get rid of or sack the Ports of Auckland directors, and ACIL will have to do this. But I am not assuming that this will go ahead. That's a fairly radical step. Ports of Auckland and ACIL have been talking for the past few weeks over this work continuing at the request of Mayor Len Brown. He has ordered them to have a reply on the council table by this morning so the meeting can go ahead this afternoon. This meeting is closed. We won't be able to report it, but any decisions from it could be made at another council meeting on Thursday. So who knows what will happen.
Just as a point of discussion, if a company is not responsible to its shareholders but is responsible to itself, can you sort of think of any implications where this could end badly, and do you have a personal opinion about it?
I think Ports of Auckland need to do this work if what they say is true, that bigger ships are coming here, more tonnage is going over the wharves, more cars are definitely coming here, and the ships, from what I've read and what I've seen on other overseas websites, bigger ships are definitely coming here. Where they would be able to berth them, who knows without these extensions. There have been people saying, they can go to Northport and they can go to Tauranga. They can't go to Northport without millions and probably billions of dollars being spent. Northport only has enough berthage for 2 ships, and they're 2 short ships. Tauranga is busy just handling all the cargo it already has, and also the upgrade of roads and rail down to both of these ports would cost a lot of money. And other people have suggested the wharf or the port goes somewhere else, that would cost billions of dollars, and the council couldn't fund it. And would the government fund it? Probably no. So we're just left with being looking at, some people have suggested they look at a tenant-landlord relationship where the council remains as the landlord, but they keep the land, but they sell the port operation and the port becomes the tenant. They've done this in Sydney and it's been quite successful, and the local government there has got a lot of money out of it. I think for Kembla and Sydney ports they got nearly $5 billion. And the ports are being run efficiently, and also they're able to expand. Whether this would work in Auckland is a different story, because so many Auckland's are against any expansion of the port, and the only way they can expand is out into the sea. But talking about the shareholding, it is unusual, and it is written into the port's constitution that ACIL and the council can suggest what they do, but they can't order them what to do, which is a very unusual situation.
If it was, say, a different topic, let's ignore the actual subject for the moment, whether it's merits or non-merits. What if, for example, the port company wanted to do something else, something different that is clearly a lot of people were very unhappy about? How do you think this could be resolved in future if it was some other issue?
Well, it's very difficult to know, because if it was some other issue, they'd be facing the same problems. It's all about the harbour and how Auckland perceives itself. Is it a port city or is it a harbour edge city? In the last probably 20 years, people have gone away from thinking it's a port city to feeling it's a harbour edge city, so therefore you need different types of activities and different types of development, which includes, housing and parks and all that sort of stuff. But the port area is a working area, and under the tenant-landlord relationship, they could say to the port operator, well, this is the amount of land you've got, you'll have to work within this and you have to make it work. And that's probably what's happened at other places. And I should imagine if it was another situation, the council would probably do the same. They want to squeeze the city. They don't want it to go out. They don't want it to go onto Greenfields land. So in all activities, they're saying you've got this amount of land, you're constrained by this amount of land, you just have to make your activities work within that area.
Well, it's a pretty fascinating topic, and I'll be really interested to see the outcome of these sort of governance legal issues and how it works for the future. Moving on. Yes,
Chris, I noticed that domestic rental prices have gone up quite a lot, actually, just in the past month. But you say that the figures from Trade Me don't tell the whole story of what really is happening.
Well, no, there was quite a dramatic story last week where they talked about 8% residential rent increases as reported by Trade Me. But on this one, I probably have to agree with Nick Smith, who I don't agree with very much. And I have to say that this is not the whole story, because that 8% rent increase was an asking rent increase. It's not an actual rent increase. If you want to know what actual rents are, you can phone the tenancy services and you can get all the latest figures there. Some of it's on their website, but if you're in a particular area, you can find that out. Now, rents are starting to accelerate away a little bit, but it's been a curious feature of the market that they have lagged well behind house price sales. And no one's exactly sure quite why this is, because you'd think that if there was a lack of supply of houses, then, rent should be able to go up. At the same time, of course, wages have not rocketed away that much. So, there comes a certain point where there's a resistance to be able to pay high rents. It seems, according to the figures that we've looked at through some of the various agencies like Crockers and others, that Auckland rent increases are possibly less the rate of growth is less than in Christchurch at the moment, and we can only put this down to the number of itinerant workers here at the moment in Christchurch where I'm based. Hopefully for the people that need to rent, this isn't going to be a huge feature of the market, but it's hard to see how it can't be. If prices are going up, landlords are going to want their return at some stage. But again, this is offset by the ability of people to pay, plus the other element to it is that we have very low interest rates at the moment, so the justification for landlords who are paying a mortgage to raise their rent might not be that strong as it could be if interest rates were much higher.
It's pretty similar to the commercial market in a lot of ways, because the rents aren't rising there that fast, because it comes down to ability to pay. And
Indeed.
Unless tenants can pay, there's no way landlords can force rents up.
That's right. I want to move on to another topic for you, Sally, in a second. I'll just make one quick aside on a story I did for Property Investor. It was about one of Christchurch's most prestigious old buildings, Samuel Hurst Seeger-designed Fennerton House. It's being sold as is, where is. We have this crazy situation in Christchurch where we have people have been paid out for their properties and they still own their properties. The insurance company does not take ownership away from them, and there are obvious reasons for that, because for a start, insurers have no claim over land, so the actual block of land, it has no interest in that because it doesn't insure that. Bare land is uninsurable, so of course the owner continues to keep that. And when it comes to the actual house, if it's been written off, well, the insurer is not interested in dealing with that or taking it away because that costs money. So we have this situation where people will get a full payout for, say, let's just assume so it's $500,000 because their house has been written off. They still own the house and the land, and in some cases, if it's safe, they can rent it out. Now, there's an unresolved situation because, what happens at some point if you want to get insurance? Insurers are probably not going to just front on up. You have to get compliance, building, all that sort of stuff. So this building is going to be pretty interesting to see how it goes. It's it's about 9,000 square metres a section. The rating value is about $5.5 million. And if the example of other such properties are anything to go by, they may well get somewhere around about that $4 million level, which is quite bizarre, but it's becoming a common feature of this market here. Now, moving on to possibly our last topic, can you tell us a little bit, Sally, about the Ormiston Town Centre in Flatbush, which I think is going through the next stage of its development?
Yes, this is one of the biggest developments in Auckland. It's a 19-hectare town. It's going to have all the usual services, plus it's going to have 20,000 square metres of commercial property. It is on the outskirts of Auckland. It is near the Highbrook Business Park. Whether people will want to set up shops and all of that sort of stuff there could be debatable, and whether they want to do it in a hurry. Pak'nSave is setting up a 6,000 square metre supermarket there, and the first of the houses is starting to be built. Within 5 minutes of the town, there are 22,000 houses. So I guess they're getting the mass of people for a township like this. Just down the road is Lion Breweries, which works 24/7, 7 days a week. And next to that is Fairmont Golf Course, which big property developer Jimmy Kirkpatrick and his group have just bought. It's zoned light industrial. There have been rumours he wants to put housing there, but it's debatable whether he'll be able to because of its close proximity to Lion Breweries. But in the meantime, the council owns the land that this town is going to go on, and Todd Group, a well-known New Zealand company, are doing the development after Nigel McKenna started it, but he was made bankrupt, and so Todd Group took over. So it's going to be a huge development, and it's going to be attached to Barry Curtis Park, and Barry Curtis was one of the ex-mayors of Manukau City and well known around Auckland. So it should be good. whether it's just debatable whether the commercial space will go, because most of it will be sold or leased.
I guess in the case of many of these things, it doesn't always happen immediately, and not always for the first developer, but sometimes you look at a development that you thought 10 years ago, and gosh, that's not going to go anywhere, and now it's going gangbusters, so who knows?
It's a huge area of development out there at Flatbush, but they're only starting 63 terraced houses to start off with, so, that's a small number of houses. And I suppose
early days, yes.
See how they go, and then it'll take off.
Thank you very much. And this is Chris Hutching and Sally Lindsay signing off.
NBR Radio. Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
Hi there, I'm John Stewart, and welcome to Last Call for Tuesday, the 28th of April. Grant Walker will have heads up for you on Wednesday, the 29th, from 10 o'clock. In business news, Xero has been sledged by one of Australia's highest-profile investment commentators for, as he sees it, failing to follow ASIC's disclosure rules. On Friday, the cloud accounting software company reported a full-year net loss of $69.5 million. The loss was larger than expected. Shares fell 9.4% to $20.85. On the ASX, where Xero is dual-listed, shares tumbled from $22.65 Australian to $20.32. Yesterday, that was, as the NZX was closed for the Monday-ised Anzac holiday. Xero recovered to $20.65 Australian on the ASX. It also earned a rebuke from the Australian Financial Review's Tony Boyd, who wrote, "Hot accounting software stock Xero might be Australasia's best hope of becoming a global technology giant, but it has a lot to learn about appropriate market disclosure. As a cash-burning, high-growth company, Xero is not in a position to earn profits. In fact, in the latest full year to March the 31st, Xero's net losses doubled from 35.5 million New Zealand dollars to 69.5 million Kiwi. The company refuses to give guidance on when it might break even, but it must be aware of consensus earnings numbers published by analysts." He continues, "Its key numbers were well out of whack with the consensus. Under Australian disclosure rules, a company which knows it's going to miss consensus by more than 15% should tell the market." Xero's earnings before interest and tax in the year to March was a loss of 77.2 million New Zealand dollars, compared to consensus EBIT loss of 61.5 million New Zealand. It missed the market estimate by 25.6%. NBR Online put Mr. Boyd's comments to Xero Chief Executive Rod Drury. The Xero boss responded, "The short answer is we are not in breach. The facts in the article regarding both the ASIC's requirements and the interpretation of our loss are wrong." And that story from Chris Keel. In shareholder news, management changes and stock exchange rule breaches have meant yet another bumpy ride for governance software developer Diligent board member services, which may hope groundswell from its upcoming new product launch mollifies increasingly irritated shareholders. About 40 shareholders who attended the Diligent annual meeting in Auckland on Tuesday were updated on new product progress and introduced to fresh Chief Executive Brian Stafford 4 weeks into the job. The fast-talking American tossed around superlatives like unbelievable and tremendous, but shareholders understandably remained wary given the company's recent track record. Diligent has had a turbulent couple of years, facing protracted issues with option grants, account restating, and management and board changes. In 2013, it paid $15,000 to the financial markets watchdog for a series of listing rule breaches, including failing to file required information, failing to seek authorization for director payments, and incorrectly issuing shares and options to employees. Last year, it was fined $100,000 by the New Zealand Markets Disciplinary Tribunal for failing to file 3 earnings reports on time after incorrectly recognising revenue, forcing it to restate accounts for the 2010 through 2013 financial years. Then, early this month, the company announced Mark Weldon, the former NZX chief executive, had resigned as a director, leaving the company in breach of NZX listing rules until they find another. An irate investor said, "It's disgraceful a director would leave when the company has serious breaches during the year, and now this has left the company in breach again." He wondered whether Mr. Weldon had a good reason for leaving or whether he just decided he was better off with TV3. Those at the meeting heard Mr. Weldon handed in his notice in August last year, yet a replacement had not filled his boots nearly 9 months later. Executive Vice Chairman Greg Peterson told NBR Radio after the meeting the board had taken the appointment seriously and would probably announce a replacement next week. And that story from Callida Smiley.
To the courts. A High Court judge has allowed living expenses to be released to internet entrepreneur Kim.com. The German giant went to the High Court in Auckland in February, asking that the remaining $4.6 million he has in government bonds be unfrozen. Mr. .com said his estimate for continuing legal fees was $2 to $4 million, and he wanted $186,865 a month in living expenses. The Crown, joined by a movie studio opponent, said he should not get the money because he's had access to other unrestrained funds. Mr. .com said he needed the money because his trust mostly comprised shares tied up in Mega, and while this was estimated to be worth about $30 million, he could not access it because the shares are blocked from sale until the listing in late May. Justice Courtney has already held that Mr. .com's legal expenses will not be subject to a reasonableness test. Justice Patricia Courtney said the costs Mr. .com had proposed for shared care for his 5 children, 2 of whom are autistic, was not unreasonable. The decision says it's the costs associated with the house Mr. .com occupies that have been the subject of most criticism. She said while the rent is $1 million a year, or about $80,000 a month, there are practical considerations in requiring a change to more modest accommodation. Justice Courtney said little would be saved by requiring Mr. .com to move into more modest accommodation pending expiry of the lease. I therefore accept that in the particular circumstances of this case, a figure of $80,000 a month is reasonable for accommodation. The judge also found the maintenance cost for the grounds and pool reasonable and also allowed $15,000 per month for security, $35,000 for staff and $20,000 for general expenses. She reduced a staff allowance from $35,000 to $25,000 and said $20,000 was too high, reducing it to $15,000. In all, Justice Courtney released $170,000 a month, which Mr. .com has until his lease expires, at which point it will be reviewed. Mr. .com told NBR Radio he is grateful for the decision, saying it's fair and reasonable. He said it gives us a fair chance to fight back, something Crown Law tried to prevent. All we need now is a little bit more time for the new and finely funded legal team to prepare for the extradition hearing. I'm hopeful, he said, that the High Court will ensure that we get a fair extradition hearing by giving the new legal team enough time to prepare. The High Court last week heard a judicial review application to review a Judge Nevin Dawson's decision to have the extradition hearing on June the 2nd. That decision has been reserved.
NBR Radio with Bayleys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
This is NBR Radio. I'm Jason Walls, talking to economics and political editor Rob Hosking about the economic and political week ahead. So, Rob, obviously the big story of last week was the whole Ponytail Gate fiasco. So, first of all, has this all passed? Is there more to come?
I suspect not. I think we sort of reached peak ponytail at some point on Thursday night or Friday morning last week. It was a significant story, and I know some people have said, "Look, it's it was a trivial matter." It wasn't a trivial matter at all. It was actually kind of serious. But I think in the absence of anything new happening, I think okay, we've got the basics here. Let's move on. And there has been a bit of sort of push to try and keep it going by various partisans, although interestingly not so much within the main opposition parties. And that's I suppose that's to be expected, but it's kind of reached the point where it's okay. If there's nothing new to come, yep. I think most people are going right. We got the basics. We know what happened here. Let's move on.
Okay.
The one exception might be, I suppose, is if the opposition parties try to make a run of it in Parliament this week, because Parliament's been away the last few weeks. It starts a session. It starts another session this afternoon. We may have a bit more there. It'll be interesting to see how the opposition parties play it.
And so, do you think this is going to impact National in the long term at all?
We'll have to wait and see on that. I think I'm sticking to my original call, which is I think it will have damaged them with a number of women voters. That has been John Key's great strength as National's leader, is that he's pulled up more women voters across to National than any National leader going back to the early days of Sir Robert Muldoon, before he alienated an awful lot of women in New Zealand. And that's you could point to all sorts of things. Given MMP environment means that elections are always won very narrowly. But arguably, that majority or that extra support that Key has amongst women voters has been the difference between him being Prime Minister and not being Prime Minister. So in that sense, it's quite significant. We're 2.5 years or even a bit more away from an election. People probably won't be talking about this in November 2017. But it's just one of those things that chips away at somebody's, at a political leader's support base. And even if it doesn't actually turn voters off, who currently support him, it will make it, you spend political capital in this game, and it was a spending and a waste, frankly, of some of Key's important political capital.
Okay, and let's talk about something else. So Bill English, he's doing his pre-budget speech on Friday. So, what are we to expect from this?
Bill English makes a virtue of delivering boring, solid, respectable budgets, and there's no problem with that. We had 20 years of exciting budgets, and it almost drove us to bankruptcy. Budgets, as anyone who has tried to do a household budget knows, budgets are boring. They're meant to be. They're not meant to be branches of show business. We're about due for the usual, budgets aren't exciting as they used to be from sort of aging baby boomers. And frankly, I think that's a load of balderdash. I get very annoyed when I hear that. So I'm going to sort of preemptively condemn that now. Look, there'll be a few pointers on where the surplus or deficit is heading. I doubt, the signals so far have been that we're not going to have a targeted, the surplus this year that National promised. But it'll be pushed into next year. That's going to dent them a little bit because they made such a big deal of it, I think unwisely, and I sort of said so at the time. But I don't know, so long as A, the trend is in the right direction for the government books, and B, more importantly, the trend for the economy is so good. And we're looking at 3.5% growth in GDP over the next few years each year. So look, seriously, I don't think that will damage them that much. The question will be around, are there going to be any other policy changes flagged? We might see a bit more in the sort of extending the model that they've already kicked off with social housing and delivery of social services by non-government agencies, the sort of contracting out framework, the effectively sort of shared care arrangement, or even an old-fashioned, what we used to call a funder-provider split, but with the providers increasingly being private sector agencies like the Salvation Army and Presbyterian Support Services, people who are on the ground with social delivery of services. Delivery of social services. That's not, I suppose, a business issue in itself, but businesses live in the community, firstly. Secondly, a lot of business people are involved with some of these social support groups. And thirdly, it does seem to be starting to deliver some results in effectively getting people who have been previously just sort of, the state writes them a cheque a fortnight and leaves them to rot. Getting people out of that rut. And that's important for our economic well-being and our social well-being and, frankly, probably our moral well-being as well, if I can use a term like that.
Yeah, sure. Speaking of economic well-being, we've got a big week in economics ahead. I mean, firstly, let's start off by talking about the Reserve Bank's statement on Thursday.
Yeah, this is the big one. There's a couple of other things coming this week, but this really is the big one. And for a big one, I think it's probably going to be quite short because the official cash rate review, the official cash rate currently is 3.5%. It won't change. I'd put money on that right now, and I'm not normally a betting person. What I think is sort of hanging over the Reserve Bank statement this time is a lot of disagreement and to the point of confusion over what the next move will be, whether it will be up or down. And the bank's chief economist, John McDermott, made a fairly lengthy speech last week, which was kind of, in a way, it really is this week's statement, delivered a week ahead. The topic of the speech was inflation and how we're looking at lower inflation for longer. And really, it seemed to signal that the next move by the Reserve Bank is more likely to be down than up, although any move at all is some way off. Now, if that is what Dr. McDermott was saying, and there's some disagreement over that, and I'll come back to that issue of the confused message in a minute. If that is the case, then we are going to see, and we already have seen, a bit of a fall in the exchange rate. It does seem to be a shift in thinking. Graham Wheeler, who's delivering a speech on Thursday, could well come out and say, people have maybe overinterpreted this, and we are sticking to our previous message of no change either way for quite some time. I think the phrase they're using is a period of stability. And that phrase, a period of stability, will be the one that people will be looking for. If it's repeated, or more importantly, if it's not repeated, then people are going to interpret it as the Reserve Bank moving towards a rate cut at some point in the next year or so.
Because there's a lot of emphasis on the language around these statements, isn't there?
Phenomenal amount of language, emphasis on the language and tone and all the rest of it. It's kind of what people look at. And I suspect, actually, the Reserve Bank might, for that reason, just deliver an incredibly short statement, because there's no press conference for this one. The next press conference is another 6 weeks, 7 weeks away. And that's the full monetary policy statement. That's when you get a set of updated economic forecasts. This is just a one-page statement. And it's quite, it's often quite what some economists just call a ditto statement, where they just repeat what they said 6 weeks ago. This is going to be very short, I suspect. It's already had some of the effect that the Reserve Bank really wants to get the exchange rate down a bit, but not too far. But they just want to take a little bit of pressure off the exporters, and some of that has happened. And the other thing about getting the exchange rate down is because global inflation is so low, they can actually afford to try and shove the currency downwards a little bit. So that's the other thing we might see on Thursday, is a bit more jawboning around the exchange rate. In fact, I'd be very surprised if we don't. But they may well. I suspect it's likely that they'll talk about the exchange rate and not a lot else. New Zealand is heading quite. Taking a step back here, I don't believe they're going to cut. Not this week and not in the next year.
So we're looking more into 2016 at this stage.
Yeah, and I don't think they'll cut then either, unless that's barring some sort of global shock or even domestic economic shock, like I don't know, another earthquake or something. Yeah. Because there is no way a Reserve Bank is going to cut interest rates when the Auckland housing market is behaving like it is at the moment.
So potentially, they could even bring them up.
No, I don't think they want to do that either. And again, partly that's because of the exchange rate. because they don't want that to sort of, they don't want the currency markets to go a bit burko.
Yeah.
And pushing it upwards. I've occasionally sort of speculated what they should do is come out and say, listen, we're going to do one big hike now, and then we're going to hold, and just use that to take the wind out of the exchange rate. The currency market sales, and say, look, we're doing it because we've got strong economic growth, even if we don't have high inflation, which we don't. We've got above trend economic growth. Sooner or later, that's going to feed through into price inflation and wage inflation, probably. So, they need to do something to take the heat out of the housing market. Come out and say, boom. And that's still, for all the talk, 2 weeks ago about, different options and, more housing accords or capital gains taxes or all those things that are going to take, 2 to 5 years to actually happen. Still, the biggest and most effective short-term weapon in the Reserve Bank's armoury is the official cash rate.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Rob. That was Rob Hosking for NBR Radio.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
Hi there, I'm John Stewart, and welcome to Last Call for Tuesday, the 28th of April. Grant Walker will have Heads Up for you on Wednesday, the 29th, from 10 o'clock. In business news, Orion Health Group, the healthcare management software developer, posted a 7% increase in annual operating revenue as growth in the Asia-Pacific, Europe and Middle East regions made up for a slowdown in North America. The company says operating revenue increased to $164 million in the year ended March from $153 million a year earlier. That's ahead of the $161 million in annual revenue expected in a Reuters poll of analysts. Shares in the company rose 3% to $4.50. Orion stock is the second worst performer on the benchmark NZX 50 index this year after the company said on January the 30th that delays in settling contracts and paying bills in North America would weigh on its revenue in the second half of its financial year. The company said North American sales were also dented as it moved customers to subscription contracts from perpetual licenses. The company says all regions experienced growth for the year except for North America. In news from NBR's New Zealand property investor, the Earthquake Commission and Fletcher EQR are winding down the Christchurch earthquake repair program. The number of repairs to be completed is a moving feast as EQC imposes a June the 1st deadline for claimants to enter the program or take a cash settlement. Next month, Fletcher EQR, the organisation set up to manage the repair program, will reduce its number of building contractors from 450 to about 100, and its directly employed workforce from 440 to 170. However, the repair work is expected to continue for many months, if not years yet, as the last most difficult repairs are undertaken. Some of the displaced staff may find jobs on house rebuilds or on the commercial work going on in the central city. And that story from Chris Hutching.
To our stock market. An analyst says hunt for value in the New Zealand stock market and you'll be searching in a barren place. Morningstar analyst Nachi Moghi told NBR Radio investors chasing yield have driven up share prices, especially in the property, telecommunications and utilities sectors, to the point where the market is looking increasingly overvalued. He says the problem is the stocks have gone up in unison, barring a few, but because yield is still attractive in the New Zealand market, investors have driven up the price of these stocks to the extent the multiples have come down from 5 to 6% a year ago to 3 to 4% now. Price earnings premiums relative to the rest of the world are stretching, but it's hard to say whether this will change soon, so investors should not be too tricky with trying to time the market. He says it's a global market, so whatever happens in the US or elsewhere, like a big sell-off, impacts our markets as well. So does this mean investors should step away? Well, not quite, says Mr. Moggy. At the moment, the New Zealand market is a barren place in the search for value. There are no best ideas at present. Investors can allocate some of the cash they have at their disposal to investing in stocks, but significant amounts of allocation towards equities will not be advisable. However, current market multiples still look attractive compared to a 10-year bond, for instance. The property sector, although more highly valued than in recent years, still offers reasonably attractive yield compared to other markets such as Australia or the US. New Zealand's major property stocks, Precinct Properties, Kiwi Property Group and Goodman Property Trust, are fairly valued according to Morningstar, offering distribution yields of between 4.5 and 5.5%. Compared with the past, these yields are low, but still compare favourably with offshore real estate investment trusts, which typically yield 3 to 4%. This is because the appreciation in New Zealand commercial property coincides with a strong rental growth outlook, while overseas property value appreciation is largely a result of investors accepting lower yields, according to Mr. Moggy. The healthcare sector has become expensive with the fall of the New Zealand dollar against the US dollar, pushing export-oriented Fisher & Paykel Healthcare above Morningstar's fair value estimate. But retirement village operator Ryman Healthcare is still fairly valued and expected to show double-digit earnings growth for the next 3 to 5 years. Mr. Moggy says, however, he finds little value in the electricity sector, with supply outstripping demand and the medium-term and electricity prices depressed.
NBR Radio with Crombie Lockwood. Fight ignorance. Let Crombie Lockwood review your insurance.
This is Jason Walls for NBR Radio. I'm here with CMC Markets General Manager Chris Smith, and we're doing a market wrap-up and a look at the week ahead. So, Chris, let's start with last week. What went on?
Yeah, morning, Jason. Yeah, overnight, we had a closed market yesterday locally, but overnight we saw the US markets open and we're pretty subdued. They consolidated last week's record gains. We saw huge gains last week on the back of some very strong earnings. Microsoft and Amazon both up over 10%. Respectively last week. The Nasdaq at record highs, the S&P 500 up 1.8% last week. European and UK markets were also higher. Our local market off 1.6% last week. We saw a big sell-off in Transpower with a huge block trade there from the Tauranga Council. But overnight markets were pretty cautious. The S&P 500 only off 8 points last night as we lead into a very busy week. Year to date, we're now looking at 2.8% gain for the S&P 500. Our local market up 3.5% year to date. The Australian market having a much better year compared to last year, up 11% so far. And the UK market also up 7% this year. Oil also was quite a big mover last week. We're seeing a lot of recovery in the oil price into the $50 a barrel and kind of itching towards $60 a barrel for West Texas.
So let's talk about Apple for a little bit. We've seen some record highs on some of their shares, haven't we?
Yeah, we saw Apple results out this morning. Huge result again. Apple continued to just defy expectations and beat every single time what analysts are expecting. China, interestingly, outsold the US for Apple in this current quarter. Huge result, $2.33 per share earnings.
Has that ever happened before? Has China ever outsold the US before?
No, I don't believe it has. I think it's a sign that the China revenue and China growth story is just continuing with iPhone sales just continuing to increase. International sales for Apple were 69% of the quarter's revenue. They sold 61.2 million iPhones versus 57 million expectations by the street. iPad sales are declining. They still sold 12.6 million iPads, but iPads certainly are on the decline, but iPhones certainly is where the revenue is coming from. The big news from Apple is they increased their buyback program up to $200 billion buyback. They continue to generate incredible amount of cash on their books, and as Tim Cook, the CEO, comments that they just don't know what to do with the cash. They have to give it back to shareholders as they are generating significant amount every quarter. With growth is still 30% plus for the biggest company in the world. It still is incredible to see the growth in iPhone sales, and Apple's general margins are holding up around 38%, which is pretty strong gross margins for a company of that size. The iWatch is going to be the next big interesting talking point for Apple and how sales go there as we see iPad sales come off.
Yeah, interesting what you said there about they almost don't know what to do with the money that they've made so much of it. I mean, they're giving it back to their investors, which is obviously good. So on the back of that, I mean, we've seen also some more records in the US to do with buybacks and dividends.
Yeah, we're seeing, this is a continuing theme we're seeing across all the major corporates in America. The S&P 500 this year it's on course to return up to $1 trillion or $1 trillion to shareholders in 2015. Last year we saw around $903 billion in shareholder either buybacks or dividends, given back, because these companies have so much cash on their books at the moment. Interest rates are at record low levels, so they have little option but to either buy back shares. And the concerning point around buybacking shares at the moment is that they're buying back at record valuation levels. But dividends are increasing, which is a positive sign for the market. There's no point in these companies keeping money on term deposits or in treasuries as interest rates are still at record low levels, while the Fed and the global central banks continue to keep interest rates at record low levels. So buying back their own shares, increasing dividends for their shareholders is what we're seeing. Corporates are now the biggest buyers of equities and shares on the market now, and they're really continuing the bull market, which is into its 7th year. Huge buybacks, incredible. General Electric up to $90 billion. As I mentioned, Apple are now $200 billion buyback program underway. So certainly a concerning sign to see how much these companies are buying back of their own shares and not actually investing in growth, investing in M&A activity and taking over other companies or even capital expenditure. So it's a big theme at the moment and getting a lot of attention.
And while we're on the topic of US, let's have a look at this week. So we got the US GDP growth data coming out, haven't we? Yeah,
we've got a lot of activity this week. US GDP will be a huge talking point as we lead into the Fed meeting also this week. March quarter expected to show around 1.1% growth in the US market. US market certainly is growing. It is on track. They're not, they continue to post some pretty solid results, although durable goods on Friday were a big disappointment and will be another headache for the Fed. The Fed meet on Tuesday and Wednesday this week. Look, last time they mentioned unlikely there will be any rise in interest rates in June. And now expectations are looking at September. The concerning thing for the market continues to be the Fed members. They're so divided. Every week we see Fed members commenting on the market and on their view on the economy, when interest rates should be rising, what data they're looking at, and they continue to be very divided. And that is causing a lot of volatility in the markets. It's causing traders and investors to be very concerned about, are they going to, leave this too late and they're going to have some rapid, rises throughout, future meetings, or will they go early and, step it up very slowly in terms of moving interest rates higher. I mean, 25 basis points is hardly a huge move in interest rates. This week we also see the RBNZ meet on Thursday, which will, we've already heard from a few of the RBNZ's Assistant Governor, John McDermott. We heard from Grant Spencer also. It's not going to be hugely eye-opening, I think, in terms of commentary and language from the RBNZ. But I think Graham Wheeler will use this opportunity to jawbone and push the currency lower, as he does in most meetings. I think certainly we're going to move from a more neutral tone to a bit more of a dovish tone around the likelihood that we could see an interest rate cut maybe into next year. I certainly don't think we will see one this year, but inflation continues to be very, very low and very subdued and not moving at all. Oil price continues to hold lower, and we have this huge debate locally around the property market and what we can do there, and how do we push the dollar lower and try and help our exporters.
Okay, and something that's always very topical at the moment, it's the New Zealand-Australian dollar and this sort of parity party that's been chucked around the last couple of weeks. So where are we standing on there at the moment? Yeah,
certainly last week we closed, we dipped under 97 cents against the Aussie. We had another strong run last week up to 99.60 against the Aussie Australian dollar, and again failed at parity. We saw our local RBNZ come out and comment. We had some better data in Australia also, and This week we're sitting around 97.30 against the Australian dollar. We have recovered a little bit, but next week we have the big RBA meeting on the 5th of May. Very divided again as we lead into this May meeting on if they will cut interest rates in Australia. The unemployment rate and some of their data coming out on jobs has been better than expected. We're seeing, again, a very divided view in the market. So I think my view is I think we will get another push towards that parity level. I think the outlook for the Australian economy is very weak on the back of iron ore. We have their budget on May 12th, which is going to be show a huge deficit, and they're going to have to look at cutting some serious spending to try and get that deficit under control. Iron ore is not recovering, but we do have our global dairy auction next week on May the 5th, also the same day. And if we see a fourth decline in a row, a lot more attention will be put on the New Zealand revenue and how our farmers are going to cope in this current environment with, a very, very subdued and very low payout compared to prior payouts.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. That was Chris Smith from CMC Markets.
Thanks, Jason.
NBR Radio with Snap. Work, play and live connected with Snap.
In government spending news, letting people choose how their government funds for social services are spent is likely to be more costly than traditional delivery through government agencies. That's because people making choices tend to use their full entitlements, according to the Productivity Commission's draft report on effective social services issued on Monday for public submissions. The move to client-based funding of social services is a key element of the government's social policy reforms, which are in turn backed by the investment approach to social services spending adopted since 2011 by Finance Minister Bill English. The draft report encourages greater and smarter use of delegation and devolution in the social services system. The draft report finds social services that give clients an entitlement to a level of support and choice over how that entitlement is spent promote innovation and responsiveness in provision. Yet such programs create pressures to expand entitlements, increasing program costs. Program design needs mechanisms for keeping costs within budget. A commonly cited reason for the additional cost is that clients using client-directed programs tend to use their full entitlement, while clients of agency-directed services do not. The report says a pilot study by the Ministry of Health in 2010 found allocations for clients who moved from agency-led to client-directed funding increased by an average of 15%. The increase was largely due to having their needs assessed as higher than they were previously. Mr English is due to deliver his seventh and most difficult budget on May the 21st, with a major focus expected on child poverty and on getting more value for money from the $34 billion in government spending on health, education, social welfare, accident compensation, Maori development, police, prisons and social housing expenditure. In news from the courts, former media agency owner Glenda Wynyard has indicated she'll appeal a home detention sentence. Last month, the Media Council founder was found guilty of 11 Crimes Act charges laid by the Serious Fraud Office following a 5-week trial, and convicted. The SFO says in a release Wynyard was sentenced to 8 months of home detention in the Auckland District Court. The charges had included causing loss by deception, theft by a person in a special relationship, and dishonestly using a document. Wynyard had redirected payments that were due to her accredited agency Aegis to repay a debt under an invoice factoring facility. She also presented cheques she knew would not be honoured and provided false and misleading information to the Print Media Accreditation Authority in order to gain accreditation. Wynyard, who had been living in Australia since 2011, indicated she will be filing an appeal. She's been granted bail and the sentence has been suspended pending the appeal. And that story from Victoria Young.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
In news from the courts, a High Court judge has tossed out an urgent bid to get Ports of Auckland to stop construction on its wharves, saying there's not enough evidence before the court. Devonport mature student Carol Banks filed for interim relief last Friday to stop the port's construction of 2 wharf extensions. The proceeding is separate from the action taken by architects group Urban Auckland, whose case requesting a review of how the decision to allow the extensions was made is set down for June. The statement of claim filed with the High Court at Auckland says the environmental impact was overlooked and the company made a mistake as it believed only a minority opposed it. However, Justice Geoffrey Venning said there was not enough information before the court to make a decision. The judge accepted Ms. Banks' concerns were genuinely held and that they may represent the views of many Aucklanders. However, he said the work, which has been carried out in conjunction with third parties and for which the port has resource consent, should not be stopped. Ms. Banks, whose daughter has set up a fundraising page for the lawsuit, claims her property, which looks onto the port, will be affected by the extension. She says she's concerned on the public's behalf about the decision-making between Ports of Auckland and Auckland Council. Ports of Auckland's lawyer, Jim Farmer QC, said an injunction hurts the port more than Ms. Banks. Ms. Banks' lawyer, Anna Longdill, said that the matter could be timetabled for later, but she wanted the port to first give an undertaking it would stop work until then, and said the council had known of the case since Thursday. Justice Venning said that was not going to happen, but Carol Banks' lawyer says the case will now go to the Court of Appeal. The lawyer, who's acting pro bono, says the fight is not over and she would file an appeal on Tuesday afternoon. And that story from Victoria Young. In acquisitions news, Just Water International, the water cooler and supplies business, 79% owned by founder Tony Falkenstein, has got the green light for the sale of its Australian business for $11 million Australian, a transaction that will leave it debt-free. The Auckland-based company said 77% of shareholders voted on the proposal to sell the business to WaterLogic Australia to repay debt and fund growth, and 100% of those voted in favour. Just Water intends to use the sale proceeds to repay its existing $10.7 million net debt to Bank of New Zealand. The company says it was approached by WaterLogic this year about the acquisition of the Australian water dispenser rental and servicing business. It says the offer values its Australian business at 6 times 2014 annual EBITDA, compared with a Accorda Mentha valuation of the Just Water Group at 4 to 4.5 times earnings. The company said at the time, retaining the Australian business, if valued at the purchase price of 11 million Australian, produces a lesser return for the group relative to sale. Growth opportunities for the Australian business were limited because of a lack of new sites, pressure on rental rates, and minimal new product development. WaterLogic, which has operations in 50 countries, was acquired in January by European private equity investor Castic Capital, which aims to create a leading global water cooler business.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
Many workers around the world feel their incomes are worth less than in the past, and they aren't sharing in the benefits of growing economies. One reason is that incomes are taxed more as wages rise. In his Editor's Insight today, Neville Gibson examines what's known as the tax wedge. Neville, what is a tax wedge?
Well, essentially the tax wedge is the tax on labour as opposed to taxes on capital. It measures the full costs to an employer of a worker. It includes income tax, of course, but also other taxes such as for health or social security, but we don't have those in New Zealand. Each year the OECD, which is a kind of government think tank for 30-odd countries, prepares an annual survey called Taxing Wages, and it's found that the trend for most countries has been upward. In fact, between 2009 and 2014, it's gone up nearly 1 percentage point for a single worker without any increase in tax rates. And that's because of phenomena such as bracket creep, where benefits or tax rates don't move with inflation. And if you get a pay rise, you get into a higher tax band. So essentially the tax wedge is a measure of your take-home pay once all the adjustments for tax and other payments have been taken into account.
So what's the average tax wedge for these OECD nations?
Well, actually, it's a pretty impressive 36%, or just over a third. And this is marginally up over a year for the 32 countries in the survey. The average tax burden in 2010 was 35%, so that's pretty high. The survey also covers countries such as China, Indonesia, India, Brazil and South Africa that aren't really members of the OECD. And the survey shows that 23 of the OECD member countries didn't increase their marginal tax rates at all.
So how do New Zealand workers fare?
Well, the short answer to that question is better than anyone would expect if you listen to a lot of complaints about the unions and so on. In fact, the tax wedge in New Zealand is the lowest of 34 countries in the survey, and that was for single-earning married coupled with 2 children. The survey actually does several case studies, but mostly they're for single people and for married couples with 2 children, but with one of the spouses not working. In fact, New Zealand's the most generous in the OECD with child-related benefits and tax provisions, and that reduces the tax wedge, as it's called, right down to just 3.8% compared with the OECD average of 14.8%. The reason it's so low is that we pay a high degree of income tax, whereas we don't pay any extra taxes, and then working for families reduces that tax burden in the latest survey by up to 13 percentage points. And for single workers without dependents, New Zealand is the third lowest. Only Chile is better than us. Actually, it's only second. Chile is lower. But in those sort of countries, you tend not to have very high social security taxes.
Indeed. So just looking at the New Zealand figures, does this mean Kiwis are paying less income tax than they were?
Well, not really. It means that what our income tax is the full amount of taxes we're paid. We're not faced with these extra burdens for health or social security. They're all wound into it, as happens with a lot of countries with welfare states. And then a lot of that is clawed back for those on low incomes through working for families. And so it means when you add the figures up that a take-home pay is actually for the single worker, after all the benefits and taxes are taken into account, you get about 96% of your gross wage compared with the OECD average of around about 85%. This also means that the next tax cost to employers is pretty low in New Zealand. There's no payroll taxes, no extra taxes. It all goes in one single tax.
Is the situation better across the Tasman?
Well, there they have payroll taxes, and while the wages are much higher across the Tasman, the tax wedge is also higher in percentage terms. So for single workers, it's 27.7% compared with the OECD average of 36%. And for a single earning family with 2 children, because there are benefits in Australia for those, it drops down to 17.5%. The trend has been downward in Australia from 2000, but if you look back just over the past 5 years, it's actually risen by nearly 1 percentage point. I'm not quite sure why that is, but overall Australia's got pretty low taxes by tax wedge standards. In fact, they have the 7th lowest for single workers and the 6th lowest for one-earner families with 2 children.
Well, what sort of comparisons are there with other countries, comparisons with New Zealand?
Well, these are awesome, I've got to say. In Belgium, 55, nearly 56% of your income goes in a tax wedge, so that's more than half. Germany's the next worst, just under half at 49.3, and Hungary with 49. This is because a lot of these people are paying for social security and other charges. And for the average worker and one-earner families with 2 children, the tax wedge is highest in Greece, where they've abolished a lot of these benefits because of the financial crisis. But also Belgium's pretty high up there with 40%, and France at 40% also. So they don't get a lot back in the way of benefits when you net it out. These austerity policies, in fact, had the biggest impact on Ireland, though, where they reduced both the family income supplements and the benefits were frozen. That resulted in the one-earner families with children paying a full 1.5% more in tax in 2014.
Interesting figures. Well, we'll wrap it up there, but thanks for your editor's insight today, Neville.
NBR Radio, with Baldwin's Intellectual Property. Good ideas, great business.